Warning, we are not your attorneys. Please, don't take anything we say as legal advice. I'm Geoff.
I'm Mike.
And I'm Derrick.
And you are listening to the Not So Grand Jury,
which is still sponsored by Morwa PLLC.
All right, listeners, we'd like to welcome back former guest, friend of the podcast, Wes Rist. Hello, Wes. Do you want to give your little introduction?
Sure. I am an international human rights lawyer who specializes on mass atrocities, genocide, war crimes against humanity, all the worst things that human beings do to each other. I'm also a ridiculously massive nerd when it comes to Star Trek and watched The Next Generation as it was live on TV. Caught the first episode on network TV Saturday night at 8 p.m., like back in the day.
Okay. And I guess you're our go-to for major franchise properties.
Oh, am I the IP?
Apparently.
Because we've had you on for Marvel and now Star Trek. When we do Star Wars, we'll bring you back.
Oh, I have thoughts about the law and Star Wars.
I know you do. As Wes just indicated there, and if you've looked at the title of this episode, we are discussing an episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, which might seem a little bit odd for a podcast about the law, but we'll get into that. We're talking today about Season 2, Episode 9 of Star Trek The Next Generation, Measure of a Man. In this episode, Data, who's a Starfleet officer and a highly advanced android created by Dr. Noonien Soong, is being ordered to report to Commander Bruce Maddox, who's new to the show, that he only appears in this episode, for what they describe as an experimental refit. In other words, Maddox wants to disassemble and study Data in order to learn how he was created. Data is one of only 2 or 3 androids of his type. He is the most advanced of his, I'll use the word brothers. And hopefully, Maddox hopes that this will allow new instances of Data to be constructed. Data himself is skeptical that Maddox has sufficient knowledge of his underlying technologies to succeed in dismantling and reassembling him, and first tries to refuse the order. When that fails, he resigns from Starfleet. Maddox then goes to the local JAG at the newly built space station where they happen to be for this episode, and the JAG officer rules that Data is the property of Starfleet, doesn't have rights, and therefore is not entitled to resign. In order to appeal this ruling, Jean-Luc Picard, the captain of the Enterprise, for those who aren't familiar with Star Trek, and Data's commanding officer, agrees to represent Data in a hearing that will determine whether he is sentient and has the right to choose his own fate. Representing the other side is Picard's second-in-command, William Riker, and he will be assisting Maddox against his own will, which adds another layer to this episode. Yeah, Riker will be representing Maddox in this hearing to determine Data's fate. Now, fun fact that I want to get out of the way right now, Bruce Maddox is played by Brian Brophy, who has actually appeared on a property that we've discussed in this podcast before. He was one of the parole board members in the last of Red's parole hearings in the Shawshank Redemption. So he's in both one of the best episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation and one of the best movies ever made, which I find very interesting. So, just a little tidbit there. Wes, you gave us a bunch of notes on various things.
I may have gone deep on the notes, yes.
Where would you...
Okay, so before we start, I want to say 2 things. One, Mike is not with us today.
Oh, yes. Scheduling conflicts prevented, or maybe he just didn't want to talk about Star Trek.
Listen, if he wasn't here, Derrick may not be here. So therefore, listen, for no reason, I love talking with Wes, and I'm here mostly as comic relief today because I have very little to add. So first off, Mike's not here today. Wes is his much significantly more capable replacement, similarly to when I wasn't here and Allison was in my place. She was a much more competent host for purposes of that episode, and same thing here with Wes.
For that specific conversation, we're not disparaging either you or Mike. We recognize that I'm the most capable, but
I'm so glad I got to see that in person.
Here's what's funny
Geoff
is
is the most
that
capable.
the number of things that Geoff has gone off on over the last couple weeks between recordings and other things just makes the whole most capable thing the most hilarious conversation we have at all times. But the first thing I want to know, as someone who prior to yesterday has never watched a single episode of Star Trek The Next Generation.
Wow.
It's impressive.
So take that in
But how
mind.
many times have you watched Lincoln Lawyer?
More often than I care to admit.
Okay.
I have a question.
Sure.
Yeah.
What the fuck is Starfleet?
Oh, no, we're going to get into this.
Okay.
This is a legitimate question.
Okay.
Let's start there.
And I was about to say, let's start at really the base level of what the heck, because of course I had not watched any other episode. I jumped into and only watched season 2, episode 9, which was entertaining in its own right. And we obviously will get to our, what we thought of it later. But I will say I was a little and still a little confused as to what Starfleet is and everything along those lines.
And let me say, before Wes launches into the answer to that question, that we will get into real-world application of a lot of what we're going to be discussing here. But what sci-fi does is discuss real-world issues with one level of abstraction. Don't worry, we're not going to be just focusing on Federation law here, because most of it doesn't exist.
Real legal principles at stake here.
Excellent.
That do come into play in day-to-day life of people around the world. And I think it's a really good point because speculative fiction generally lets us talk about complicated issues in ways that might be difficult to do if we used real-world situations. That's Roddenberry's, Gene Roddenberry, creator of Star Trek, one of his underlying principles. It's what made the original series of Star Trek with Will Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, all those individuals, James Doohan, that's what made it so progressive at the time, was he was willing to talk about really complex, nuanced, tense issues in the 60s that would not have gotten on TV. And in fact, some episodes of the original series, including the infamous interracial kiss on TV between Nichelle Nicole and Lieutenant Uhura and Captain James T. Kirk, played by Will Shatner, was not streamed, was not aired in parts of the South. It was people in this television stations in the South refused to play it on TV when it came out. Let's be very upfront here. Star Trek has always talked about societal issues through a lens of speculative fiction. Now, when you get into an episode like this, which is one of the very few episodes that focuses on what you could call law. There's a question about that, and we'll get into this, but it touches on legal issues. It is complicated by the world building. We don't know much about the history. Remember, this is only the 5th season of Star Trek that's ever been produced. There were 2.5 original seasons, and then this is season 2 of The Next Generation. So we're early in the world building. What we do know, Derrick, to your question about what the hell is Starfleet, what we do know is there is the political entity that is called the Federation of Planets, the United Federation of Planets, UFP. The United Federation of Planets was started by humans and Vulcans, and then eventually grew out and grew larger. It is very overtly Roddenberry's version of the Space UN, except that it actually has governance powers. It is not the UN in the sense of we promulgate aspirational rules and regulations and laws and hope that people go along with them. It is the sole conveyor of power.
It's an amalgam of the UN and the federal government of the United States.
Yes.
In an ideal, very idealized.
It would be the scenario where if the U.S. was the entire planet, affected in kind of some ways.
But with a very overtly utopian view.
Okay.
The ideals of the U.S., not the reality of the United States.
Understood.
And
Fair enough.
very famously, Roddenberry was a utopian. He believed that that humans would rise above conflict in the future. In that, which is an important thing to know, because if you don't have that understanding, then Starfleet doesn't make sense. Because Starfleet is an exploration scientific and diplomatic entity that happens to have ships with phasers on them and wears uniforms. That is literally there, and they overtly say this all the way back to the original series. Like, Starfleet's not a military. We're explorers. We're we're scientists. We are, like, this is a refrain that comes up quite enjoyably. There's an episode of The Lower Decks where the comedic cartoon Starfleet series, where one of the characters, Boimler, is out there standing at a table trying to recruit people and loses his shit because everyone's, oh, Starfleet, poo on you. And he's, none of you get to exist doing all the stuff that you do unless Starfleet is around keeping you safe. And we don't want to do that. We want to be explorers, but we have to keep everyone safe. So we don't have anything analogous in the modern world to what Starfleet technically is. In reality, for practical purposes, because Starfleet gets to make like national security, global or galactic security or whatever arguments, they are functionally also a military. They may be a scientific, exploratory, and diplomatic entity as well. So best example is if you take NASA and the DoD and the State Department and the Department of the Interior and put them all together as one political entity underneath the U.S. federal government structure. Like, they are part of the governmental structure. Technically, their priority is exploration, science, and diplomacy, but they also have ships with phasers and torpedoes. And the captains just get to do shit. They just get to blow people up. This was actually one of the first episodes where we saw judge advocate generals be a thing. And of course, naming them judge advocate generals is like a workaround because they probably wouldn't be called that in a non-military entity. But what else are you going to call them for Americans to understand what they are?
I don't believe there are generals in Starfleet.
No, there are admirals that are not judge advocate. They are a Navy-based approach. And so it is a weird, look, the world building of anything breaks down if you dive really deep enough and try and parse it out. That said, like, Navy JAGs are called JAGs, like, even though they are in the Navy, in the U.S. military. It is worth flagging that we don't know a lot about Starfleet law specifically. We don't know a lot about Federation law specifically. Those two are different bodies of law. We learn much later in Star Trek's intellectual property's existence that Federation law is different from Starfleet law, that there are different things. We also know that there are other types of law out there. There's Klingon law, there's Cardassian law, there's Bajoran law, that kind of stuff from other properties. And more on the practical side, as Geoff said, this case involves human rights law and administrative law and technically property law too.
And a fair amount of a uniform code of military justice.
Yeah, which is what I mean when I say like Starfleet law. Like, yes, right. That is the equivalent would be the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, that governs the uniformed services in the United States. Derrick, are we on a level playing field here now in terms of understanding?
I don't think you can do anything to get me on a level playing field, but I'm playing in the sport. So yes.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Great. It is worth discussing, and you guys are the ones who actually have trial experience. My last trial experience was 20 years ago. You guys are the ones with trial experience. It's worth discussing the difference between a trial and a hearing, I think.
Sure.
And what that means, because this episode uses those terms interchangeably, and they are very much not interchangeable.
Yeah, and what we are seeing is it is not a trial under any definition of a trial that I can imagine.
Yeah,
any reasonable definition of a trial.
Because so a trial is in part made up of various hearings and then testimony generally delivered to a jury, but sometimes to just a judge, to determine certain facts and the legal consequences of those facts, basically. Hearings generally are preliminary matters that determine questions of law that will sometimes govern the trial, sometimes just be assumed at trial, those kinds of things. But they're preliminary questions before you get to the big issue.
I mean, they can also be, so like obviously preliminary hearings is a big part of it. There can be motion hearings and things of that nature, which can actually get to the heart of the matter. You can have summary judgment hearings and motion to dismiss hearings and things like that.
Oh, yeah.
But what's the thing about a hearing, which is interesting, is some hearings don't have testimony, some do, some have oral arguments, some do, and some have both. This is 100% a hearing because you're getting both, right?
Yeah. And hearings have some, when it comes to testimony and things like that, things are a
Relaxed.
little more loosey-goosey
Yeah.
in terms of rules of evidence and things like that.
And like all the things you guys talked about with Lincoln Lawyer episodes and stuff about like leading the witness and what you can say if you can testify basically as a counsel representing someone. They get away with a lot here that they wouldn't in a trial as a lawyer.
Well, I was going to say, and that's honestly pretty normal when it comes to hearings. So I'll give a good example is I've done a couple hearings recently actually for default. So I represent, this is in DC Superior Court, I represented multiple people who were plaintiffs, sued someone, served them, and they never showed. And then so it ended up being a default. After the default, you have what is called an ex parte proof hearing where you demonstrate the damages. So liability has already been established because of their failure to show. Now you're trying to show how much my client was damaged. Those are the definition of hearings. Yes, I will put a witness on. It will probably be my client. Sometimes they testify to stuff that's hearsay. Sometimes they testify to stuff that like is based on their own recollection. And then they're done. And then I give basically an oral argument summary to the judge. Many of which things would not necessarily go normally in a trial.
Sure.
They are just trying to get to the heart of the matter. There's no jury to prejudice. In fact, Wes, you brought that up with Lincoln Lawyer. That happened in one of our Lincoln Lawyer episodes where there's an objection. The judge goes, there's no jury here to prejudice. I'm just trying to get to the heart of the matter. Let's get it all on the record and we'll figure it out. And that's the purpose of a hearing. So I actually thought that is how that would have gone if this were happening in real life.
I don't think it's a problem that it's a hearing. I just think it's a problem they refer to it as a trial several times.
Yeah, fair enough.
And clarifying that is important. It is also important to flag that this is an administrative hearing, which is somewhat different because we do have an individual who is not a judge presiding over a hearing. Now, let me pull up her name again here. It is Captain Philippa Louvois. She is the Judge Advocate General for this brand new starbase in the 23rd sector, which we are told is right on the border of the neutral zone between. So think of this as the equivalent. This is 1989 that this episode comes out. This is the Romulans are Russia, and the Starfleet is the Federation is America. This is someone who's like on the border of USSR controlled territory. And because it's space, like this is a very unexplored area. They're the first people there. She makes reference to the fact that it's her and one ensign.
I have a clip.
Oh, great. Go ahead.
So, what are you doing out here?
I am in charge of the 23rd Sector JAG office. We're brand new. I have no staff but one terrified little ensign. And hopefully we can make some good law out here.
Anything is possible. So you came back to Starfleet?
Still the most worthwhile place to be.
You had no reason to leave.
So let's talk about that because, like that's not what a Judge Advocate General does. They're not out there to make some law. Like the law exists. They are applying the law. They are an extension of, and a necessary one for, in this case, a non-military organization, but in our modern context, a military one, because disputes happen when you're on a military base, not just between soldiers or sailors or Marines themselves, but between the host country where that base is and the residents of that base. This is often covered in what is called a SOFA, a Status of Forces Agreement. The United States is either renowned or notorious, depending on your perspective, of having SOFAs that give them a lot of control about what happens to service members who commit crimes in particular countries. So if you're on duty and you commit a crime in that country, there might be a status of forces agreement that says the local police don't get to hold you. We, the United States military, get to prosecute you for violating those laws, things like that. But It is true that a JAG officer is often the most forward or the most kind of out there representative of the domestic law in question. And it gives them kind of this weird power too, because they are not directly in the chain of command when it comes to applying the law. They obviously report to their superiors. They have to obey the orders that are given lawfully, especially, etc. But like, for example, and notoriously, you as a junior JAG officer might be assigned to prosecute a case on one day and then defend someone on a different day. Like, you don't work just for a DA's office or public defenders. You take on those roles. Now, if it's a big enough base, you probably are going to be assigned to do all the defense work for a period of time or all the prosecution work for a period of time. But let's say you are assigned to defend a soldier who has committed some kind of minor violation. And the commanding officer just really doesn't like the soldier. And he comes into your office as the JAG officer and says, I want you to force them to plead guilty or tell me the evidence that they did. Like, you don't actually obey that order as a JAG officer. You are outside of that kind of chain of command because your job is to serve the rule of law in that context. And she actually references that as one of the responsibilities. I thought it was one of the nice things about this episode is that she is a JAG officer when Maddox is trying to push for Data to be handed over as property. She says, hey, no, you don't get to just do that. We have rule of law in the Federation. Like, I'm here to enforce that. That's something that exists. That is my responsibility.
Data must not be permitted to resign.
Data is a Starfleet officer. He still has certain rights.
I'm sick to death of hearing about rights. What about my right not to have my life work subverted by blind ignorance?
We have rule of law in this Federation. You cannot simply seize people and experiment with them to prove your pet theories.
Thank you.
Now you're doing it. Data is an extraordinary piece of engineering, but it is a machine. If you permit it to resign, it will destroy years of work in robotics. Starfleet does not have to allow the resignation.
Commander, who do you think you're working for? Starfleet is not an organization that ignores its own regulations when they become inconvenient. Whether you like it or not, Data does have rights.
Let me put it another way. Would you permit the computer of the Enterprise to refuse a refit?
That's an interesting point. But the Enterprise computer is property. Is Data?
Of course.
There may be law to support this position.
Then find it. A ruling with such broad-ranging implications must be supported.
So that's a little longer than what you were just talking about, Wes, but I wanted to play the whole thing because for two reasons. First, JAG officers in the real world are attorneys.
Yes.
Not judges.
Correct.
She would not be the one deciding, oh, there may be law to, let's have some more briefing on that. No, that's not how, that's not how that would work. And also it gets really to the heart of what's being discussed in this case of Data's fate and that kind of thing.
Yeah. The last thing I think that's worth flagging on the administrative side of this is they got a lot about this right in terms of her role, but she would not actually probably be the one chairing this. There was an admiral earlier in the episode that was on the ship and actually tells Picard he wants to see the Enterprise and etc. You would pull in a flag officer to be the decision maker. Like, the JAG officer would make the argument either on behalf of Data or on behalf of Starfleet, which Maddox is claiming to represent. I think that's a failing in the framing of the argument, but because Maddox doesn't get to presumably speak for Starfleet just because he asserts that Data is property. That doesn't automatically then become Starfleet's position. But she would be making one side of the argument, Picard or someone else would be making the other side, and then that admiral would be sitting as the decision maker, because it wouldn't be a judge. It would, like, you're out on the frontier. You don't have it's not frontier judges riding around on horses. You have a process for this to be done. But I think it is, you're entirely right, Geoff. It does get to the heart of it, which is one of the complaints I had about the writing of this, is that's actually fairly early in the process that they identify the real question, is Data property or not? And then they spend the next 15 minutes not talking about that question until Picard goes to Guinan and suddenly is, oh yeah, what we're really talking about is Data property? And that's a problematic history that we as human beings have. Maybe we should talk about that. And then we get to the meat of it. I understand why they do that narratively and everything, but like they actually did a good job of identifying the legal issue right up front.
Listen,
then don't deal with it.
Leave it to Whoopi to get to the heart of the matter. Jeez.
Look, I remember this episode. I remember watching this. I was 10 years old. And just even I knew at 10 that a black woman on a spaceship talking about the importance of the history of slavery when we're discussing whether or not data is property was a big deal. And we should listen to what she had to say about this.
I'll go ahead and play the clip.
Consider that in the history of many worlds, there have always been disposable creatures. They do the dirty work. They do the work that no one else wants to do because it's too difficult or too hazardous. And an army of data is all disposable. You don't have to think about their welfare. You don't think about how they feel. Whole generations of disposable people.
He's talking about slavery.
I think that's a little harsh.
I don't think that's a little harsh. I think that's the truth. But that's a truth that we have obscured behind a comfortable, easy euphemism. Property. But that's not the issue at all, is it?
So this is where I want to Derrick's point at the beginning, I want to bring in some of the actual history of what we talk about here. Because I think most people, I don't know, I think there is a chance that people forget that in the history of the United States, not only did we have the 3/5 compromise, which everyone is taught about, like the Constitution did not apportion voting rights because obviously enslaved individuals were not given the right to vote, along with a lot of other people. But states that wanted to have political power based on population wanted to be able to count those individuals even though they could not vote. So that's the 3/5 compromise, indelible stain at the heart of the formation of our country. However, in the Constitution, Article 4, Section 2, there is specifically the Fugitive Slave Clause, which says that enslaved or, I forget it, bound to labor or something, whatever the phrase is, individuals, indentured individuals, must be returned to the people that they escaped from. And then later we see this in the Fugitive Slave Act and in Supreme Court cases that uphold this idea that if you happen to escape to a free state, you are still property and must be returned to that, which to my mind privileges the law of the slave state over the law of the free state by saying, and this is true in American legal structure, property matters a hell of a lot more than people do in many ways. Like we pride ourselves on this idea that we don't put a value on a human life, but because we don't put a value on a human life, we do put value on property. And if I can prove monetary damages around property, it's until relatively recently, it's been a lot easier to get civil penalties, liabilities, etc., around property damage than it has to non-physical harm to individuals or denial of freedom of movement or denial of access to specific rights or privileges, things like that. And that is built into our law. And it also goes to a point that I think comes up throughout this, which is that there is this, it's not explicitly stated, but there is this sense throughout the episode that Louvois is just doing her job as a lawyer. Like she's representing or deciding around this by having this conversation where she has to decide if a sentient being is property or not. And perhaps it is relevant.
Even
to
whether
get to the
he's
point,
sentient or not.
Yeah, it's relevant to get to the point that the real question here is not actually whether he's property or not. The real question is whether or not he's sentient. And that's how the argument plays out in court. It's fantastic, wonderful scene. But it's actually a dangerous idea that Louvois is just doing her job here. There is this clip at the beginning where it turns out she prosecuted Picard because he was in command of a starship that was destroyed, the Stargazer, one of his first commands, and he bore a grudge because she came after him. But it is her job to do that, to have a captain's mast and a hearing and find out what went wrong. He felt she did it overzealously, and he took that personally, and obviously it caused sparks between them. Whether that was before or after they boned, we don't know. But that was her job, and she wasn't doing any. I have no concerns about her doing that, whether she was overzealous or not. When you're deciding on whether or not a person gets to exist as a person, it is not okay for the lawyer to just throw their hands up and say, I'm just doing my part in the system. There is a reason that a lot of my legal heroes, like Thurgood Marshall, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, even not just lawyers, but like politicians like William Wilberforce, Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, like these individuals worked within the system, but challenged the system and said, I am not willing to go along with the presumption that the system makes about the quote unquote right way for my people or my community or other people to exist in this system. And so it is not okay, I would assert, it is not okay for lawyers to just sit back and say, hey, my values should not have a role in deciding how I do my job. It is true that your professional ethics are different from your personal morality. But if just because you can do something that is within the bounds of your professional ethics does not mean that it is moral for you to do. And I worry that this idea of Louvois was just doing her job, that's the role she's supposed to fill there. No, like ultimately she has the capacity to have decided all of this much, much easier. The moment Maddox says data is a computer, he's not a sentient being, he's property, she could have shut that down and said, no, I don't care what the law says. Obviously, he is a functioning sentient being. Otherwise, we wouldn't have let him go through Starfleet Academy. Otherwise, we wouldn't let him run like away missions and be in charge and promoted him and given him awards and all of this. Like the evidence is so self-obvious that he is treated by Starfleet as a sentient being that she could have shut it down at that first mention, and this would have been a 5-minute episode.
Yeah. I mean, there are times in the series, and I don't, whether or not they fell in like season 1 at all or not, but Data is at times entrusted with command of the Enterprise when the command crew is elsewhere. Like, he is not just the ship's computer or anything like that.
No.
To what you were talking about a bit ago, Louvois initially makes a ruling. She decides summarily, essentially, that Data is property. I'll go ahead and play the clip, but she talks about one of these sort of fictions within the Star Trek world. We're going to get a little bit of Star Trek law that's
it's dumb.
Interesting.
I have completed my research based on the Acts of Cumberland passed in the early 21st century. Data is the property of Starfleet. He cannot resign and he cannot refuse to cooperate with Commander Maddox.
So we don't know what the Acts of Cumberland say. We do know they are 300 years old.
Yeah. Like this, and they exist prior to the formation of the political entity that is the Federation, because that didn't come into existence until the late 22nd century. But like functionally, this is the equivalent of our current day Supreme Court saying that some statute from the 1600s, 200 years prior, 175 years prior to the existence of America as a political entity, governs the current understanding of our law. Like that, no.
Sadly, Geoff is fully aware that seems like where they're going, but that's besides the point.
Yeah, except there are areas where that is what they do. Like, Second and First Amendment law lately is, in colonial England, people were allowed to carry firearms and blah, blah, blah. So therefore, now we must allow X, Y, and Z. Or a lot of this reminded me of the Dred Scott decision.
Yes.
Because that's what they do in the Dred Scott decision, too. And I pulled up some bits of this. The Dred Scott decision, for listeners, is, I would say, by many, credited with kicking off the Civil War, in contributing significantly to the Civil War happening in the 1860s. What essentially happened in this case was a slave owner relocated, I don't know if temporary or not, from a slave state to a free state, and attempted to, or did, keep holding slaves. And one of his slaves, Dred Scott, attempted to challenge that. He said, we are in a free state. Slavery is not legal here. I, my wife, my kids should be allowed to leave. And there was a lot of back and forth. This case was argued multiple times before the Supreme Court before they actually reached a decision, because they decided they hadn't done enough briefing, so they waited a year. And I want to read, I copied a ton into our notes. I'm not going to read all of it because it would take 15 minutes, but it's also 1850s language, which is a nightmare to read. I tried to pick some of the easiest bits. So first off, the question that the court analyzed, which is very similar to what we have here. And again, I'm going to read this verbatim. There is 1850s language in it. None of it is the worst of 1850s language, but it's not great. And for that, I apologize. Fair warning. Just be aware. The question is simply this. Can a Negro whose ancestors were imported into this country and sold as slaves become a member of the political community formed and brought into existence by the Constitution of the United States, and as such become entitled to all the rights and privileges and immunities guaranteed by that instrument to the citizen, one of which rights is the privilege of suing in a court of the United States in the cases specified in the Constitution? So you can take out a few words there and sub in and choose whether or not to resign from Starfleet from or resort to the courts for redress of grievances. And that's essentially the question that that Louvois is asking here. And how the Supreme Court arrived at their conclusion was no. Dred Scott is not a free man nor a citizen of the United States. He is the property of his owner. The reasoning they use there goes back to, again, laws of England. Let me find the right clip. Let's see. They had, for more than a century before, been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. He was bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise and traffic whenever a profit could be made by it. The opinion thus entertained and acted upon in England was naturally impressed upon the colonies, and they founded on naturally impressed upon the colonies they founded on this side of the Atlantic, and accordingly the Negro of the African race was regarded by them as an article of property, blah, blah, blah.
Geoff, there's also a piece that says the opinion was at that time fixed and universal in the civilized portion of the white race. It was regarded as an axiom in morals as well as politics, which no one thought of disputing or supposed to be open to dispute. Let's pause and recognize that's just not true.
Sure.
That assertion that everyone believed that this is how individuals who are not white should be treated in primarily white nations, and that it was fixed and axiomatic, not true. Objectively not true, argued extensively in the Parliament of the United Kingdom at the time, quite extensively. I am so frustrated by this idea of we judge them by the standards of their time, as if abolitionism didn't exist from the very first slave ship that the Dutch East India Company ran. And people knew that this was morally wrong and justified the hell out of keeping it in place. And the Supreme Court in Dred Scott flat out lies about this. They know this isn't true, and they assert it as a truth in order to make a legal justification.
They do a little qualifying by saying it was undisputed among civilized white people that this was the case.
So the people who disagree with us are uncivilized white
essentially
people?
Yeah. And I also wanted to highlight, a lot of this gets into originalism, which is currently the sort of in vogue way to interpret the Constitution.
Boy, could I go on a rant about that.
We may want to do a sidebar about originalism with some, but I wanted to read this, what the Dred Scott decision says about the Declaration of Independence. And on this one, I am going to go a little long because I need to read it. Of the Declaration of Independence, the court says, quote, "It then proceeds to say, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The general words above quoted would seem to embrace the whole human family, and if they were used in a similar instrument at this day, would be so understood. But it is too clear for dispute that the enslaved African race were not intended to be included and formed no part of the people who framed and adopted this declaration. By the way, neither did women or people who didn't own property. Just a little insert on my part. Let's see. For if the language as understood in that day would embrace them, the conduct of the distinguished men who framed the Declaration of Independence would have been utterly and flagrantly inconsistent with the principles they asserted. And instead of the sympathy of mankind to which they so confidently appeared, they would have deserved and received universal rebuke and retribution. Yet the men who framed this declaration were great men, high in literary acquirements, high in their sense of honor, and incapable of inserting principles inconsistent with those on which they were acting. That is such a bizarre statement for a court to make about just human beings. They were incapable of cognitive dissonance.
And less than 100 years later, less than 100 years later, they're like, no, these people could not have been hypocrites who were self-serving in the way that they designed their governmental structure. No.
Not at all. Of course not. Derrick, we've been talking for a little while.
You have. But I want to note two things. One, the one thing we haven't said, although it's assumed, and I think even the sort of non-lawyer would appreciate it, the Dred Scott decision is considered to be the worst decision by the Supreme Court by far.
Yeah, that and Korematsu.
And I still think most people would argue that Dred Scott is the by far number one. Like, that's generally speaking. So, like, when we're talking about any comparison of Dred Scott to what may or may not have happened in this unknown law that the JAG captain says in our show, I also want to note that even during the midst of the Civil War, they still managed to get an amendment signed 8 years later, overturning it.
Yeah.
And as I recall, like, easily passed, right? I think both of them were like...
in part easily passed because the state governments were captured. So.
Understood, but I guess the sort of point I'm making is that, like, she's relying on law that if it's at all close to the Dred Scott decision, which it does sound like in certain ways it may be, you would think that in this sort of scenario of there being a overarching government, that they would have realized how dumb this is and overturned it at some point within the last 300 years, hypothetically.
A government that by its nature is seeking out intelligent life and to somehow draw lines between life forms that are part of the representative government of the Federation and life forms that are not, which I find really interesting.
This is actually, because there's that wonderful quote at the end, and I know we'll get to that clip, Geoff, of Picard's summation, but this is one of the things where I think English actually fails us here as a language, because we talk about people, and humans is a biological term, but people is something else, and personhood might be a better word, the best we can get to in English, but many other languages have this gradation of entities that exist in the world. For example, animals that are just animals that don't have any sentience whatsoever, that you don't ascribe intelligence to of any kind. But then progressing up through this idea of, especially in the early ADs, be up to and including the Middle Ages, this idea of there are people, AD, sorry.
I thought you meant the early 80s.
No, Anno Domini, ADs.
The Common Era.
Yes, the Common Era, thank you. There are people who are not our tribe, but that we recognize are people. And there are people who are not our nation. Nation wasn't used the same back then, but our community, our broader community, but who are still people. And there are people who we recognize are clearly humans. They look like us, they sound like us, they talk like us, but they're not our people. And then there are people who don't look anything like us, and we don't know anything about them. We don't know where they come from. Their skin's different color, their hair's different color, they speak a different language. We don't know anything about them, but they are still people. The problem is, in English, when I describe this, I'm using the same word to describe people all the time. In other languages, there are gradations of words that allow you to talk about the distance between communities and groups from what you know to the unknown and the thing that is out there that you cannot appreciate and cannot predict. That is a very helpful linguistic tool to have. And we don't have that in English. And I think it goes directly to that point of Starfleet should have developed language to talk about the other and the thing that is out there that is an entity, that is a being that we recognize as having the same right to participate in our social and communal structure, whether or not they look, act, or whatever like us. There are multiple episodes of Star Trek where non-corporeal entities, things that don't have bodies, are given the right to exist and involve themselves in the political structure. And yet Starfleet gets hung up on the fact that Data has wiring for his brain instead of nervous systems. That's the defining limit for them? Come on.
Yeah.
Hi everyone, Derrick here with a brief message. The Not So Grand Jury is sponsored by my law firm, Morwa PLLC. One of Morwa PLLC's many practice areas is business law. If you are a business owner or someone who is thinking of starting up a new or side business, you need a legal team who can efficiently provide you legal counsel, keeping you and your business away from potential legal issues, and if necessary, representing you in any disputes that do arise. We pride ourselves on being cost efficient while also getting to know our clients. If you want less stress and more support, you need more law. If you would like to set up a free consult, please click on the link in the show notes, visit our website, www.mooreatty.com, that's mooreatty.com, or email us at contact@mooreatty.com. And now, back to the show.
Yes.
As I circle back to Data and his lack or his supposed lack of emotions, it is canon within the show that Data does not have emotions until after The Next Generation ends, and he is given in one of the Star Trek movies an emotion chip that allows him to feel emotions. It is clear, even in this episode and throughout the series, Data has emotions. It is pretty fucking obvious that Data has emotions. He wants to keep the book that Picard gave him. He keeps the little holographic portrait of Tashiar, the person that he slept
gets
with.
a cat and cares for the cat.
Definitely, yeah.
Shoot, even in the poker game, like, he has an emotional reaction to losing the hand.
Yes.
Yeah, surprise. Surprise is an emotion.
So I do love, I get it. The concept of Data is he's an android without, but he clearly has emotions. And
well, and I think later on, there are not quite retcons, but there are attempts to explain this as like Data understanding how his emotional development occurred, and that this was a process that took place over time, that he was exceeding his programming, so on and so forth. But yeah, it's really boring to write a character who has no emotional response whatsoever, because they're just a blank wall. Like, you can't act off of that. There's no good story that comes out of that. And so, unless you're just hitting the same point of no emotion guy has no emotion every time.
Yeah,
sure. So let's dive into the actual hearing where they are really discussing sentience, personhood, that kind of thing.
So before you jump in, I just want to state, and then I want you to play aspects of it, but I have purposely not read Wes's notes on this because I actually wanted to note that I think Riker does a pretty damn good job considering he doesn't believe what he's doing.
He certainly does. And actually, let's maybe before we get into this scene, can we talk a bit about the absurdity of how this system apparently works?
Yes.
Because no, this is all just wrong.
I'll play that clip first. Hang on. Yeah, here we go.
What if I challenge this ruling?
Then I shall be required to hold a hearing.
Then I so challenge. Convene your hearing.
Captain, that would be exceedingly difficult. This is a new base. I have no staff.
But surely, Captain, you have regulations to take care of such an eventuality.
There are. I can use serving officers as legal counsel. You, as the senior officer, would defend.
Very good.
And the unenviable task of prosecuting this case would fall on you, Commander, as the next most senior officer of the defendant's ship.
I can't. I won't. Data's my comrade. We have served together. I not only respect him, I consider him my friend.
When people of good conscience have an honest dispute, we must still sometimes resort to this kind of adversarial system.
You just want me to prove that Data is a mere machine. I can't do that because I don't believe it. I happen to know better, so I am neither qualified nor willing. I'm going to have to find someone else.
Then I will rule summarily based on my findings. Data is a toaster. Have him report immediately to Commander Maddox for experimental refit.
I see. I have no choice but to agree.
Good. And I expect you to do your duty in that courtroom. If I find for 1 minute that you are not doing your best, I will end this then and there.
You don't have to remind us of our duty. You just remember yours.
So, first of all, in the real world, we've talked about how the JAG core does not really match up with what's being described here.
challenge.
Yes. Immediate appeal. By that this afternoon.
Right now.
So,
We should have a sound effect for like legal tropes. Like, boing, this is a legal trope.
Oh,
the hearing happens tomorrow.
I so challenge.
Yeah.
That's my favorite part about that. The rest of it's hilarious, but my favorite part is just I so challenge. And that's all that was necessary.
It's so dumb.
So dumb, it's brilliant.
No! It's just dumb.
So
good. I made fun of Geoff in our last recording for not making use of it, and now he's making use of it. I'm very happy.
I love it. It's great.
I've got to apparently amp up what I was first cautioned not to, and I really tried not to because I don't want this to be the Howard Stern show, but apparently I do it too little. Okay.
Yes.
In the real world, you cannot, like, anyone serving in a JAG officer role must be an attorney. That is required by the Code of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. That is required by federal statute. And in no scenario, let's set aside the rule that you have to be an attorney. In no scenario are you going to have a friend of the opposing side be the attorney. Be the attorney who is
counselor, at least. Be the counselor.
Right. Yes. And the the idea that this is how this system would work, that you would build an entire starbase, and Star Trek starbases are like cities, essentially, and not have any attorneys there, or have like, one and an ensign.
This is, think 3 aircraft carriers, and an aircraft carrier has 5,000 people, and there's a whole JAG office on the aircraft carrier. Like,
sure. And so the idea that it would be just her and an ensign and that's it is absurd. And then for non-attorneys to be drafted in to represent both sides of what she describes as an adversarial system designed to get to the truth is so stupid. Now, interestingly,
dumb.
I am by no means an expert in any of this, but in reviewing the UCMJ, I was not able to find any provisions for like emergencies. What if you're like in the middle of nowhere and need to have something adjudicated, but you don't obviously have an attorney on hand, or 2 or 3 or however many you might need. There doesn't appear to be any provision for that scenario, which I find interesting.
Because you don't. You go back to a spot where they have them and then do the hearing there.
I would assume you wait until you do and maintain the status quo.
It's why things like administrative detention exist. Like a commanding officer can put someone in the brig and hold them pending a hearing or a review. If that means you put them on a plane and fly them back to the closest military base where there's a functioning JAG office, then that's what you do.
This would be the equivalent of Starfleet not being able to put somebody on a flight from New York to LA come on. What, you have faster than light travel. What are we talking about here? I understand it's a TV show and you got to have drama. There's a later episode of the series that delves into some more of this in some interesting ways, but we're not going to review that for a while, I think, because obviously Derrick's not interested in any.
I'm not, but also significantly even more dumb than the fact that they have to do that is her statement that if he doesn't, she will summarily grant the other side.
Yeah.
Because that's
Data is a toaster. Starfleet owns him. Are you asking to be overturned? Let's assume she's the decider of fact and law anyway. She's not, but let's assume she is. Her justification when she writes up this order summarily deciding against Data is, well, his best friend, second best friend, because Geordi is Data's best friend, refused to prosecute him. The dumbest justification.
And in the real world, let's say this played out the way it does, where Data wins. Maddox appeals. Because she is not dictating law for the Federation from this frontier starbase or whatever.
Administrative hearing.
Right. She's going to determine for all time whether androids have rights, which apparently she didn't, because in a later series they don't. But there's like all of Picard is predicated on the fact, Derrick, there is a later series just called Picard, on which Wes and I disagree, that is predicated entirely on there is now a race of like sub-datas that don't have any rights and are slaves. Yeah. So none of this matters.
Apparently intentionally designed to be just a little bit lower than Data on the sentience thing so that they could get around this.
Sure.
Yeah.
Standard.
Yeah, there would be an appeal of this anyway. She is not the final arbiter of anything. The legal procedure of all this is just absurd. So
there's a point here that I want to, before we dive into the hearing itself, after the hearing, Data is having this congratulations party, hooray, you're not property party. I don't know what the banner is for that, but in 10 Forward, which is their bar, and Riker is hanging out away from everyone because he feels bad about having been forced to do it. He takes Data's hand off. He turns Data off. Like, he makes all these statements. And Data comes over and in this very nice moment recognizes that Riker was coerced into this, that if he hadn't done it, Data would have been summarily found to be property.
Sir, there is a celebration on the holodeck.
I have no right to be there.
Because you failed in your task.
Oh, God, no. I came that close to winning, Data.
Yes, sir.
I almost cost you your life.
Is it not true that had you refused to prosecute, Captain Lavoie would have ruled summarily against me?
Yes.
That action injured you and saved me. I will not forget it.
You're a wise man, my friend.
Not yet, sir. But with your help, I am learning.
I want to call this out because this is a human rights concept that I don't think a lot of people know about, or we don't talk about in society, which is the concept of moral injury. Moral injury is when you witness, perpetrate, or fail to prevent acts that deeply violate your own moral beliefs. In this context, because he was required to do. Now, this is, I should clarify, this is distinct from the I was just following orders kind of defense of I didn't want to do this horrific, heinous thing, but it is on that continuum of being made to do things. Like coercion comes into play here. Riker's being made to do this out of his care for Data. If he doesn't do this, he's worried that Data gets no chance whatsoever and ceases to exist like tomorrow because Maddox has all this set up at the starbase. There's no appeal apparently, like he just gets Data and is going to take him and do his mind-wipey stuff to Data's memory. Riker feels like he is acting out of a sense of imminent harm, of risk of harm to Data, but he is still acting in a way that violates his own conscience, that is wrong in his mind. And he's being forced to do this by the institution to which he has signed up and committed his life and is serving. And so that creates, like, the research on this is very clear. That creates traumatic harm in people that has long-term consequences in how they live their lives. And in this case, he is actively perpetrating, he's doing something, so he's taking an affirmative step. But even if you're in an environment, and I know, speaking as a former Fed who's no longer employed by the government, who has colleagues who are left in, who are not working at the Department of Homeland Security or even at the Department of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, but employees of the federal government and are feeling very much harmed by the fact that their government is doing the things that it is doing in places like Minneapolis. This is the definition of moral injury, of people experiencing harm because they are employed by or in a situation in which they feel that they should be able to change or do something to stop a bad act that goes against their own personal morals and cannot do so for any number of reasons. And we do not talk about this. This is a common thing with American military service members. Like, frequently we see this with service members who come back home and are dealing with PTSD issues. So this is not oh, that's too sensitive of a person. No, this is a thing that happens to human beings who have strongly held beliefs and want to act in accordance with those beliefs and are put in situations in which they cannot. And yeah, I appreciate they don't call it that, because I don't even know if 1989, if they use the term moral injury, but that is what it's talking about. And I appreciate that complexity of writing, because it's a throwaway moment. It's 30 seconds at Data's party at the end. And yet it's a recognition of that having taken place, of Riker having to gone through that. I think they do it story-wise so that Data and Riker aren't like angry at each other, even though Data can't be angry, as we've established. But like in the next episode, they don't have to keep this beef going between Data and Riker. But by doing so, they actually have a really meaningful conversation about moral injury, and it's good. All right, should we talk about the actual hearing?
Yes, let's get into the hearing.
We could talk about the trope of Riker starts with Webster's defines.
I will tell you, movies and TV shows love using definitions, and it's either Webster's or it's something else. That happens all the time, and it's almost never a good argument.
Commander, what are you?
An android.
Which is?
Webster's 24th Century Dictionary, 5th edition, defines an android as an automaton made to resemble a human being.
An automaton.
Riker is making an essentialist argument. He's saying that Data cannot have rights because Data is an android. Data is a thing that exists outside of where rights come from. This is essentialism. This is the argument that we, as human beings in our modern world, in our reality, we have rights because we are human, not because of anything else, not because we as a people agree on what rights should be, not because we find them to be necessary for existence in society, but because we are human, we have rights. This is essentialism. It comes out of, to a certain extent, people argue about this, it comes out of this kind of thing called natural rights, which is God created us with these rights like that. Has all kinds of problems, as Geoff could speak to quite a bit. But this idea of essentialism is actually still debated in human rights law as to where do our rights come from, because it matters, because then you do get to how are you legally allowed to exclude certain people from certain rights, and what rights count as rights. I hate to do the dictionary definition, but like a right is an enforceable obligation that you as an individual can bring against a government. It matters that we call it a right, that it is recognized, that in some cases, it doesn't even matter if there is a legal principle that is written down on statute, that you still get to enforce this. Most of our constitutional law is deciding whether or not the written rights that we have in the Constitution encompass new things, like we expand upon it. For example, speech, money is speech, is an example of an expanded right. So that essentialism is Riker's core argument. He has to make that argument because it's the only way he can morally exclude Data.
Verified. Lieutenant Commander Data. Current assignment, USS Enterprise. Starfleet Command Decoration for Valor.
Your Honor, we'll stipulate to all of this.
Objection, Your Honor. I want this read. All of it.
Sustained.
There's no record here. They're not.
No.
There's 3 issues right there, which is hilarious.
Sure, go ahead.
There's no record. So who gives a crap? If he can object, so it's weird. We'll stipulate, and then he objects to the request. Wait, that's not how that works.
You just don't stipulate.
He literally says, He says, we do not agree to the stipulation. You should hear this, Your
you
Honor.
always have to stipulate. You don't object to a stipulation. You just don't stipulate.
We'll stipulate. And congratulations. I'm not. Done.
Yeah.
Moving on. The judge doesn't even have to rule on that. So that's funny. I also like how she sustains an objection. Like, it was weird. The whole thing was weird. I love how it started off so stupid. All right. Moving on.
Commander, what is the capacity of your memory and how fast can you access information?
I have an ultimate storage capacity of 800 quadrillion bits. My total linear computational speed has been rated at 60 trillion operations per second.
Your Honor, I offer in evidence prosecution's exhibit a rod of parse steel, tensile strength 40 kilobars. Commander, would you bend that?
Objection. There are many life forms possessed with mega strength. These issues are not relevant to this hearing.
I'm afraid I can't agree, Captain. Proceed with your demonstration, Commander.
I'll say if this were a trial, I would have objected already that none of this is relevant.
Yeah. I'll touch on all of that. I don't know what a kilobar is.
You'd have to have someone testify to what this thing is.
Yeah. Mega strength also is apparently a thing.
Yeah. Well, they have a Klingon on the ship.
The commander is a physical representation of a dream, an idea conceived of by the mind of a man. Its purpose, to serve human needs and interests.
It's a collection of neural nets and heuristic algorithms.
Its responses dictated by an elaborate software written by a man. Its hardware built by a man. And now a man will shut it off. Pinocchio is broken. Its strings have been cut.
Okay. So there's a couple different things here.
A few. Yeah.
Yeah. One, Riker's, I think, Derrick, you're right. Riker is making a good argument. He has been handed a shitbox, but he is making the best argument he can make, which is, again, around this essentialism structure. He is not arguing that Data is not a sentient being. He's arguing that Data is not human. Now, that should obviously, in the Federation, which meets aliens all the damn time, in which human rights aren't a thing, and they very carefully don't use the word human rights, they just say rights over and over. That should be, like, we shouldn't even have to have this argument, because the point is not whether or not Data is human, it's whether or not he's sentient. And I think when Picard introduces the rod, when Riker introduces the super hard rod and Data bends it and asks Data to bend it, Picard rightly objects, because that should only matter if the question you're trying to prove is whether or not Data is human. Like his processing speed, his memory, his super strength, all of those only matter if what you're trying to prove is Data human or not. By the time Riker says, I'm going to take his hand off, Picard objects and then waves it away because he knows it doesn't matter. Now, what I have a problem with is he's not gleefully sitting there waiting for him to be able to say, none of that display matters. That was all cheap parlor tricks, because the question isn't whether or not Data is human. The question is whether or not Data is sentient. Picard is sitting there in his feelings going, oh no, I'm going to lose my lieutenant commander. This is all really terrible. Riker's proven this really well. No, he hasn't proven the thing that is the actual question in play here. But it makes for good courtroom drama, even though we're in a hearing. It makes for good courtroom drama, and Picard has to be seen to be in his feels about this. But it's dumb, because, like, he already identified the core issue. Data is not property. I say he is property. I object to that ruling. What's the line, Derrick? Like, I so object, or whatever. Dispute. Whatever it is that Picard says. Like, he knows the right answer here, which is, and we were all taught this on lawyers, find the one thing, find the legal principle, the question of fact, the question of law that all of this hinges on, and hammer that thing. Like, don't get distracted by all the extraneous stuff. What's the pivot point? Where does this come down to if you believe this, it's this decision. If you believe this, it's this decision. And hit that pivot point. It's why you want a lawyer in this, not a starship captain and a diplomat in this position. Because Picard doesn't know that Riker has unwittingly handed him a really great winning argument, which is to say everything that he just told you is irrelevant. Everything he just showed you is irrelevant because I don't care that Data can bend really strong pieces of steel.
Yeah, what Riker should be trying to do is somehow proving he isn't sentient, which and we're also in the Star Trek world where if a crew member's hand is removed, they can reattach it.
Yes,
so
throw people's stuff back all the time.
Not only is it irrelevant, it's not even relevant for what they are putting forward as.
Yeah, and give me a tool and I can turn off a crew member too. I'll be committing murder, but it's not a special skill.
And another thing that we're talking about this as a hearing, not as a trial, because he is making an oral argument to the judge, judge in air quotes. Yeah. He's both taking testimony, he's eliciting testimony and himself
giving
testifying
testimony
to the judge, which that would probably not be allowed, even in
an administrative hearing.
Yeah.
It honestly actually evokes a lot more about civil law traditions where it's an inquisitorial hearing, not an adversarial process. And the judge asks questions and engages, but that's not what they've set this up to be. I think one of the things that's interesting to me is like this argument about its heuristic algorithms, it is data processing. Like this is the argument people are having about our current AI right now, not general artificial intelligence or whatever the thing is that everyone's worried about coming next. But like you guys had the sidebar out AI law. Like, this is one of those questions right now. AI just is a pattern predictor. Like, it's a pattern repeater. It predicts the next word. It replicates patterns from large-scale things that it has consumed. That's the actual question. Is Data just responding to... Is Data an LLM?
Right.
Is he just a self-contained walking LLM with so much more capacity and processing power than we've ever seen because he has a positronic brain, compared to... Is he sentient? And that's where once we finally get back into Picard's element, that's where we are.
And it's clear from this episode and plenty of others that Data has an internal life.
Yes.
While he's on his own, is responding to stimuli and having thoughts.
He doesn't sit in his room in his off hours and just stare at a wall.
He doesn't lie dormant until someone queries him.
Yes. So we get into Picard's argument here. And finally, after having his aside with Guinan and all of that, Picard remembers what this is actually about. He's known what this is all about because he's the one who's made the argument from the beginning. Is Data or is he not self-aware, sentient? They give us the question of what sentience is: intelligence, self-awareness, consciousness.
Verify. Maddox, Bruce, Commander. Current assignment, Associate Chair of Robotics, Daystrom Technological Institute. Major papers.
Yes. Suffice it to say he's an expert. Commander, is your contention that Lieutenant Commander Data is not a sentient being and therefore not entitled to all the rights reserved for all life forms within this Federation?
Data is not sentient, no.
Commander, would you enlighten us? What is required for sentience?
Intelligence, self-awareness, consciousness.
Prove to the court that I am sentient.
This is absurd. We all know you're sentient.
So I'm sentient, but Commander Data is not.
That's right.
Uh-huh. Why? Why am I sentient?
Well, you are self-aware.
That's the second of your criteria. Let's deal with the first, intelligence. Is Commander Data intelligent?
Yes. It has the ability to learn and understand and to cope with new situations.
Like this hearing?
Yes.
What about self-awareness? What does that mean? Why am I self-aware?
Because you are conscious of your existence and actions. You are aware of yourself and your own ego.
Commander Data, what are you doing now?
I'm taking part in a legal hearing to determine my rights and status. Am I a person or property?
And what's at stake?
My right to choose. Perhaps my very life.
My rights. My status, my right to choose. My life. Well, it seems reasonably self-aware to me, Commander.
Picard does some good lawyering there by having Maddox define what is sentience, because we're going to use your definition. I'm going to hold you to it.
Yep.
I really like that.
And forcing Maddox to definitionally prove it. I think where he actually where he misses an opportunity is just what he should have said to Maddox is, can you prove to me that you are sentient? That you, Commander Maddox, are a sentient being. Without resorting to, I am human, therefore I am sentient, because that's once again an essentialist argument. The court doesn't have to listen to a ipso facto. It is because I say it is. It's true because I say it's true. That's a legal fallacy. So the decider of fact is not swayed, should not be swayed by, I'm a human, so obviously I am sentient. So Maddox, you've defined sentience as intelligence, self-aware consciousness. Prove to me you have all of those. And I think he can do an interesting job of saying Data is more intelligent than you. You can't really compare self-awareness, but he obviously has self-awareness. What is consciousness? And this is, to be clear, and I think this is what actually the episode is trying to convey from a science perspective, we don't know what consciousness is. Like, even modern neuroscience can't actually define consciousness. Because it's an external definition of an internal thing that exists in our heads. Like, philosophers have been talking about, like, this goes back to Plato's cavern, Plato's cave all the way back. So is perceived reality for you guys the same as perceived reality for me? I don't know. Like, I can never know objectively.
Plato in every college dorm room where someone's had a bit to smoke.
Yeah.
What if you're
it
red?
Doesn't even require that, because I've never smoked anything, and I had those conversations in college too. So yeah, like, you can't prove consciousness. And if your requirement to deny existence and the rights of being a person depend on disproving a thing that cannot be disproven, you should fail that argument. Like, you should just, that should not be the valid grounds on which you get to deprive a group of people for their right to exist, I would assert, as a human rights lawyer.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
So Picard does, I think you're right, Geoff. Picard does do good lawyering here. He has an opportunity to make it more dramatic that I think they skip out on. He also comes back with this quote of
Your Honor, a courtroom is a crucible. In it we burn away irrelevancies until we are left with a pure product, the truth, for all time.
I wish that were true.
It's objectively not true. It is also actually an essentialist argument itself. Courts can discern objective reality truth. Like, no, they can't.
Yeah. See our earlier discussion of the Dred Scott case.
Yeah. No.
Correct.
Yeah. I am impressed with how they did this narratively and as a story structure. It's really bad from the law. Thankfully, Picard remembers that he's supposed to actually be arguing the point of the hearing, and so he does so, and then wins on that point. And we get the nice little scene with Maddox, like, referring to Data as a he instead of an it, which is actually a thing that is true about people and othering. Once you meet the individuals that you are usually dismissive of or discriminatory against and know them as people, it becomes a lot harder to treat them as others because now you have a personal interaction. And so Maddox was like, I don't know him, but now I want to. He seems cool. Maybe I call him a he instead of an it. And yeah, that's how basic human empathy works.
Yeah. I don't think I have much to add beyond that. Derrick, were there any...
I don't have much to add on Picard. I think you hit the sort of nail on the head, which is he does a decent job of lawyering without being a lawyer. Certainly better than what some lawyers I know would do in that situation. And
shots fired. Okay.
Yeah.
Not to anyone I know. I think. I hope. Anyway.
The cat lawyer during Zoom or during the pandemic.
I am not a cat.
I mean, we have seen recently some absolutely terrible lawyering from the Department of Justice of all places. So
hypothetically. Yeah. So what I do want to get into, and if this would have been in the clip, we can obviously wait to drop this clip, that part in, which is her decision. My favorite part of her decision is exactly like real life. She recites stuff and then just makes a decision that has nothing to do with what she's recited.
Yeah. Here, I do have that short clip. I'll play it.
It sits there looking at me, and I don't know what it is. This case has dealt with metaphysics, with questions best left to saints and philosophers. I'm neither competent nor qualified to answer those. But I've got to make a ruling to try to speak to the future. Is Data a machine? Yes. Is he the property of Starfleet? No. We've all been dancing around the basic issue. Does Data have a soul? I don't know that he has. I don't know that I have. But I have got to give him the freedom to explore that question himself. It is the ruling of this court that Lieutenant Commander Data has the freedom to choose.
I'm not sure if any of those things go together.
No. Also, everything she says before the question, is Data property no, is dicta. Like, none of that actually matters.
Again, we don't have, no one's transcribing this. There's no, well, okay, let me back up. Data himself is essentially a transcription service.
And the Star Trek computer system is also as well.
That's fair. But she issues no written decision.
Computer cancel.
Wes, you're muted all of a sudden. Okay.
What would you like me to cancel?
You said computer.
My Alexa is set to respond to the word computer because I'm a big Star Trek nerd. And when I said that, it went off.
Naturally.
Well, that says everything pretty much right there. And by the way, it just happened again because he said the word computer again and he had to, yep, I love this. Yep. Okay. So.
Lots of fun.
Here's what's funny. I was going to say that her decision is hilarious and doesn't make any sense. But yeah, I've had real judges that have done that to me where in oral argument, they've had the decision ready to go and have restated the law, restated the facts, and then said one side wins with no real analysis or no real application, she doesn't even do a good job of restating it. She goes off into this whole metaphysics area that I don't think anyone was really talking about.
Does he have a soul? Do I have a soul? I don't know. I mean, at least she's willing to admit she doesn't know if she has a soul.
That raises a whole question of justiciability that we've never really talked about on the podcast, but the courts recognize that there are things they just are not qualified to decide. One of those being, what is consciousness?
And to your issue, Geoff, there have been any number of people who have tried to get courts to declare there is a God.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And the courts have wisely said, we don't comment on the metaphysical.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't want to get...
She uses the word soul, but intrinsic personness. Really, is what we're talking about here.
And she mentioned metaphysics. I don't think that's right. Metaphysics is basically, it's a branch of philosophy that talks about the basic structure of reality. That's going way too far beyond what we're talking about. We're talking about whether a thing is a thing or a human. That's what we're talking about. She's really pushing this into a whole nother level that she really did not need to do. But again, I love the fact that she doesn't even do a decent job of acknowledging the problem. She creates a different problem that no one really talked about, riffs off of it, and then goes, but he's not. Kind of period. Without any explanation.
She doesn't even go into the consequences of, if we are wrong about this, what are we requiring? We're requiring Data to go through forced experimentation. We're denying his right to refuse medical treatment. We're denying his right to have voluntary separation from a non-military entity. Starfleet doesn't conscript people. There aren't press gangs going around. There's no draft to enter Starfleet. So there's no stop-loss orders to keep Data in this context. If she's wrong about this, what are the rights that are being implicated here? There's no discussion of all of those things.
This is essentially a hearing to decide whether Data lives or dies.
Yeah. And no one actually points out the fact that the entity that we know as Data, whether or not he is actually truly sentient, the entity will cease to exist. And that's never actually raised.
Yeah. Any other legal issues or anything that we want to touch on? Let me just scroll through our extensive notes here and see if there's anything that I want to mention.
One thing I wanted to flag, Maddox, we played it earlier, but that clip of Maddox saying, rights, rights, I'm sick and tired of everyone talking about rights. What about my right to not have my life work subverted by blind ignorance? There's a big problem here, and I alluded to this earlier. The word rights has a specific legal meaning that is a little different than how people use it in daily conversation. And that's okay. Like, it's fine for the average daily use of a word to be different and lawyers to have a more technical usage of it. But when he is in the middle of he's not in the administrative hearing yet, but when he's making an argument to a legal decider, in the case of Lavoie as the JAG, it does matter that he is conflating his ability to pursue activities that he wants to pursue and equating them to Data's legal right to have existence and to make choices and have autonomy and agency. And I feel like that is a thing, because we use the language of rights and people talk about that, especially in America, where we all know we have certain rights. We're taught this from a very young age. We assume that the right to make decisions about my own life allows me to force compliance from other individuals. That in order for me to be able to live the way I want to, I should be able to impose upon you certain standards of behavior. And I think, Geoff, a lot of what you do deals with that question of, does someone have a right to free exercise of religion? Having that right, does that allow them to impose that religion upon other individuals?
Sure. Yeah. It comes up a lot. A lot of people, there's the aphorism of my right to swing my fist ends at the tip of your nose.
Yeah.
And lately, a lot of people feel like that their rights extend well into my face.
Yeah. But this is what Maddox is essentially asserting. He's saying, I do have the right to punch Data. Not only do I have the right to punch Data, I have the right to turn Data off forever if it means that my right to my research would otherwise be impeded. Which, let's be clear, he doesn't actually have a right to research. There's no right for that.
He has no statute, as far as we know, within Federation law, he has no statutory or constitutional right to do scientific research in whatever manner he sees fit. Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, and this has nothing to do with the law, weird episode for LeVar Burton, by the way.
Yeah, no, he's literally in like 3 seconds.
He folds very early in the poker game and adds nothing to that. And then he's just a sad sack for one scene. I get it. I get why he's sad, but that's his whole episode is just that.
Yeah.
Geordi is, I would say, mistreated by the writers of this show for most of the run. He is depicted as something of a sad sack. Wes and I could talk for a while about some of the episodes that focus on Geordi and what a disservice is done to his character. And
astonishingly, at the moment when LeVar Burton was at peak relevance in the culture, like LeVar was a star, because Reading Rainbow made him
Roots, but Reading Rainbow too. Yes.
Yeah, but like for young kids, like when I was watching this, I did actually watch Roots. Like my parents sat us down and we watched Roots as a family together. Like it was a thing that we did, which was interesting looking back. But I lived and died on Reading Rainbow. Like I can still sing that song. LeVar curated the books I read in my life. Every library in America had a shelf that was the Reading Rainbow recommendations of that week. Like,
right. Before there was Oprah's reading list, there was Reading Rainbow.
Yeah.
Okay. Sure. Anyway.
It was a joke.
Not even going to touch that.
I don't have anything else. I'm happy to do a sidebar on originalism because I hate it with a fiery passion, but I don't think it's relevant for this.
Let's get into our reviews then. Let's see. How do we want to approach this? Derrick, I am really curious your thoughts. Let me say, I think it's fairly clear how we all come down on the legal question. But Derrick, I'm interested to hear your opinion. So why don't you go first?
Okay. So let's talk about entertainment. And this is a weird one because, again, coming into something I've never watched before in the middle of the second season with a sort of, again, I generally understand Star Trek but I've watched some of the movies, but I couldn't tell you the last time I sat down and watched something involving Star Trek. Anything I've learned has been because of popular culture involving Star Trek, at least in the last 10 years. So I had a general idea what I was getting into. I know generally who Picard is. I very quickly learned that Data is some form of robot, and we got there. I will say this makes me want to watch more, which I can't believe I said out loud.
Okay, interesting.
Again, I'm not sitting here telling you this is one of my favorite things I've ever watched or this is like top tier, but I think I would want to watch more just to learn more about the universe and how it works. And I'm really curious when you don't get into the sort of legal stuff, what the heck happens on the show.
Sure.
So I would say, yes, it was entertaining on the entertaining front, having been a sort of come in completely clean and watch it. I listen, the poker scene pissed me off, but what movie poker? I've never watched a poker scene in a TV show or movie that's ever made me entertained. In fact, that made me rewatch it so many times. I actually learned more about the show. On the legal side, this is interesting because there are certainly things that they get wrong, or at least don't make sense. Like the 21st century law doesn't make any sense as to that would be the, like, you're telling me that's the thing that she's relying on? Like maybe she needs a better research attorney if that's what she's relying on.
Yeah, she needs a better ensign.
Yeah, that poor ensign, by the way. I don't have a staff except for some poor ensign. I'm like, he's your staff. Let's give a little respect, for God's sakes.
Also, he never gets to make an appearance.
They don't get any screen time, yeah.
Shouldn't the ensign be the one arguing for instead of Riker, for God's sakes?
That's an interesting question. Yeah.
All judges encourage junior associates to make arguments in trials, including the trial I'm coming up on in a month. They want juniors to do things and do directs and get involved. Why is this not the perfect time to have the ensign get involved? Sad. But weirdly, we've gotten off on a tangent. Who would have thought?
Who would have thought?
But they get certain things right. So they get one thing they do get right, which I think is probably correct, is there would be a hearing to figure this out, right? Would it happen a mere minutes later, basically, or a mere few hours later after, again, the JAG has made a decision? No, but the JAG also wouldn't have made decisions, and also the JAG wouldn't have been the judge, and also that Riker wouldn't have been the person arguing, and also Picard wouldn't have been the person arguing. In fact, that whole hearing makes no goddamn sense whatsoever. And so, given that's the main part of it, I think I have to say the law fails, and it's simply because the trial/hearing does not make any sense. Like, the concept of a hearing makes sense. It wouldn't have it wouldn't have happened in the time it happened. It wouldn't have happened with the people it happened with. None of that makes sense. I think I gotta go no on the law, but I will also say that didn't take away from the show. Unless hypothetically we were listening or watching it for a legal podcast, then it took away from it. But if I was generically watching this out in the wild, it wouldn't have taken away from it. I would have been like, well, that's weird, but I would have focused on everything else. I would be like, yeah, weird. Star Trek has some really weird rules as to who's on what side. Apparently the first in command takes this side, the second in command takes this side, and that's just how it works. Okay, that makes sense. So I'm a yes on the entertainment, no on the law, but again, I actually think it was entertaining. I was actually shocked that I was entertained.
Okay, good to know. Wes, I want to give you the last word. I think we had your first time on, we let you go first. You're now a veteran. I'm going to give you the last word, and you're our subject matter expert for this episode. So I'll say, on the law, no. Within the fictional law of the world that Star Trek presents, no. She is looking at law from a system of government that no longer exists. In fact, I think she would be looking at an act that within the canon of the world was immediately in the wake of a nuclear war on Earth.
Before the nuclear war.
I thought we can, okay.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure, but okay. Which, yes, makes no sense. And in terms of looking at how this, if you have any sort of reasonable legal system in that world, it would not function this way. In our world, this system does not function that way. The JAG system does not function this way. The Uniform Code of Military Justice doesn't look anything like that. And yes, Starfleet is sort of NASA with military discipline on top of it. And that's just not how any of this would work. In fact, under the under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, only commanding officers and generally only like admirals if we're talking about the Navy, which is what I'm going to use here, can even convene a court-martial, which is what this hearing would be happening within the context of. I think this hearing would have to be happening within the context of some sort of broader legal dispute.
Yes.
Data v. Starfleet or something. I don't know. Yeah. Or in-ray data probably is what it would be.
Yeah, it might be within the context of a court-martial for refusal to obey a transfer order.
Something like that. Yeah. But that would be convened by the admiral that we saw at the beginning. She wouldn't just be able to say, oh, all right, we'll start a legal case and I'll decide it in the next 2 days. No.
That's how that works. We're just going to start it. It has been started.
Yeah. So on the law, no. On entertainment value, absolutely yes. Star Trek The Next Generation is an interesting example of a show because I would put this episode among perhaps the top 5 episodes of this show. And this show, there are episodes that are among the worst I've ever seen on television, and there are episodes that are among the best I've ever seen on television. And this is absolutely one of the best from an entertainment perspective. Give Patrick Stewart as much rope as he wants, and I will watch. I don't care. Derrick, I'm really glad that this gave you a positive impression of the show. What's interesting is that in this era of Star Trek, it is very episodic. This episode is somewhat of an outlier because it refers back to things that have happened in other episodes.
Interesting.
You would not generally have heard about Tasha Yar. This is one of the spoiler alert for anyone who's not seen Star Trek, but Tasha Yar, the character that Data was intimate with, dies at the end of season 1 and is mentioned perhaps 3 times for the rest of the show.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And this is one of them. So the rest is, I don't want to say it's entirely episodic, but what I would recommend is that Wes and I give you a list of episodes to not watch.
Yeah.
Well, I will say I was actually just looking through right now, like all the episode guide, and this is considered one of the top rated ones, surrounded by a bunch of awful ones, by the way.
Yeah, because the first and second seasons, they were still figuring out what the heck they were doing.
Got it.
They really don't hit their stride until, the end of season 2, and season 3 is well regarded.
Interesting.
So in terms of entertainment value, yes, definitely. I will watch this episode again before this episode of this podcast comes out, because I'll have to pull a couple more clips and I'll just watch it from beginning to end.
But you possibly would have watched it anyway.
Oh, quite possibly. You mentioned we're watching this in the context of a legal podcast and that could ruin things. I have mentioned in some of our prior episodes, I don't remember why I liked Scrubs. And some friends of mine have said that's because you're doing a show where you're nitpicking. This has not colored my experience of Star Trek The Next Generation, even though it is bonkers not how anything would work. So, yeah. I stand by my Scrubs opinion. Yeah.
I'll tell you, we didn't watch great episodes of Scrubs, just for the record. We watched illegal-ish episodes of Scrubs that I don't necessarily think are the best examples of good Scrubs episodes, personally.
Yes. But I do remember, I did watch Scrubs the first. I liked Scrubs. I've seen it multiple times through, but not in quite some time. And I think I know why. But that's a total digression. Wes, your thoughts?
Yes. So, look, entertainment value, this is a strong yes. I'm happy to make it a 3-judge panel on that. This is one of my favorite Star Trek episodes, not just Next Generation episodes. Like, when I watched this as a kid and when I watched this before I became a lawyer, still one of my favorite episodes. Like, I knew then that this was an important episode, that this mattered, even before I had like the human rights law background to understand why, to me personally, it matters. I still appreciated what they were trying to say. And I think in many ways, this reinforced my love of Star Trek commenting on things. Like, Star Trek has an opinion here, and it's not shy about putting that opinion forward. And frankly, if you go back and watch even the original series, none of that is shy about its progressive politics either. So yeah, don't come at me with like, Star Trek got woke. Star Trek has always been progressive, always. And if you find you disagree with that, you've probably changed, not Star Trek. When it comes to the law, ultimately, I have to come down on a no, but I think it's closer than I really figured, because, Geoff, everything you said is entirely correct. But that is all process issues as well. That is all structure and organization. If they had if there was just one change in the writing and they had packed all of this up and flown everyone back to Earth and had this at the Luna High Court and had the arguments there, all of that would have disappeared. And we'd have looked at this and said, the substance of these arguments is the substance that they should be arguing about. The questions of fact and law that they get into in deciding this issue are the right questions to be asking. Do they take a long time to get there? Yes, so does every other legal show.
Sure.
Because you draw out the narrative drama. Picard knows the right question to ask, and we probably could have done this in a 30-minute hearing and not like this very long multi-day administrative hearing that we've got. But if you change that one writing fail, which is just so that they can get Picard and Riker to be arguing against each other over their friend Data. And so I understand why narratively they do that. But if you change that, our legal objections to this basically go away. And
maybe
that doesn't change the fact that in the context of the not so grand jury, this is a failure on the law, because even within their own structure, as Derrick pointed out, like they don't even follow their own internal legal principles that they have put forward. And this is early days Star Trek. So we don't actually have a lot of the law and they still fail to abide by their own. But substantively, they're asking the right questions. They are struggling with the right issues and they are getting to the right answers. And that's worth acknowledging. It's still a fail, but it's a closer fail than I thought. Like when you said, hey, let's watch this and comment on this, I thought, wow, this is just going to be such an easy no on the law, yes on the entertainment. I was a lot closer than I really expected to be.
Interesting. I don't particularly disagree with anything you said, but I think we did give justice to the conversation that this episode is trying to have. Yeah. Nevertheless.
I think we've gotten to the point where the two of you, where one of you writes the majority opinion, and then I write a concurrence where I say I agree on everything, but I'm going to spend 30 pages on the poker scene and tell you why it sucks. Because I agree with you guys, but also that was ridiculous.
Your footnote.
I'd read a lot more judicial holdings if they did that.
Yeah. Also, ISO challenge.
ISO
challenge. That's what it was. I'm going to have to clip that just to have on the sound bank.
Oh,
100%. 100%.
All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you for joining us, Wes.
Thank you for me, Derrick, and Wes. we'll have more Star Trek discussions in the future.
Yeah, I love it.
All right.
The Not So Grand Jury is sponsored by Morwa PLLC.
The opinions expressed in the Not So Grand Jury are those of the hosts themselves and not of their respective employers.
The theme music for the Not So Grand Jury is from Gustav Holst's Jupiter and is in the public domain.
If you'd like to get in touch with us, if you want to suggest future movies, or even if you want to offer corrections, you can email us at notsograndjury@gmail.com or message us on any of our social media accounts.
The Not So Grand Jury is copyright 2026, all rights reserved.